Well, hello. Welcome to my study. As you know, we've been working through Genesis as we have considered eschatology, the doctrine of the end times. I had one listener who thought that my study of Genesis was incredibly good, which I appreciate, but I don't want to lose sight of the fact that we're looking at eschatology as we walk through these early books of the Bible. Now, as we have made our way now to the book of Exodus, I've been thinking a lot about the theology of Exodus, and what I've come to recognize is that Exodus is absolutely central to our understanding of redemption. And I would also argue that Exodus frames the entire Bible. The idea of Exodus is not just for Israel, but it's for the entire world. Of course, God is working through the nation Israel, but Christ will lead the entire world on an exodus in the future. We need to recognize that this theology of Exodus is carried throughout all of Scripture. You might even say that Genesis is the foundation of our theology. Genesis is the beginning of our understanding of theology, and Exodus might be considered the cornerstone of our theology. Exodus sets the course for all of redemptive history. So, really, to understand the Bible, we need to recognize that Genesis sets the agenda, the foundation, the big picture. But Exodus sets the specific course, and it gives us the exact road to redemption. I want to show you that. I want to show you how this works. In the book of Genesis, what we found is that God created the world, and that God has created the world for his glory. And we also found that he created man, and that man sinned against him, that man was created for a purpose. He created them male and female, but he created them and he said to them to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Yet man, in his sin, chose to disobey. The disobedience came in the form of eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which God commanded him not to eat. The result of this sin was that God cursed the ground, and he drove Adam and Eve out of the garden, which is ultimately a separation from him. So that sets the problem. So we have the beginning, we have this idyllic garden where Adam and Eve dwelled with God. God walked with them. And then we have the problem of sin, which now they've been driven out of the garden. Their sin has cast the whole world into sin through the sin of Adam. And so the rest of redemptive history, the rest of history is a search for the seed in Genesis 3:15. So who is going to be the seed? Now, in Genesis, we have obviously the flood, Genesis 6 through 9, the flood narrative where God judged the world. The sin of the world had filled the earth, and God judged it, and he left Noah and his family. And we find in short order that Noah is not the seed. And then we fast forward to the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel, they tried to build a tower to the heavens. They tried to make a name for themselves. And God came down and he confused their languages and he scattered them over the entire earth. And the question became, where does the seed come from? In whom will we find this redemption? And then Moses begins to narrow that down by introducing us to a man named Abram. And Abram was promised a land, a seed, and a blessing. Now that land, seed, and blessing promise was handed down from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob to Judah. And that actually leads us up to the situation where Jacob's family was taken into Egypt. In Exodus 1, we find that God is causing them to be fruitful and multiply. At the end of Genesis, in Genesis 46, we found that the tribes of Israel, the sons of Israel and their families, went into Egypt. The sons of Jacob went into Egypt. we have that story of Joseph and Judah, and ultimately God using the sin of the brothers, especially the sin of Judah, to bring Joseph into Egypt, which saved Israel from the famine. Now, as we know, Judah was redeemed, that Judah ultimately saw his sin and understood his sin, and he repented and he did the right thing by his brother. Yet we know that God used all of that and he brought them into Egypt. Now, when you look at Exodus chapter 1, you might notice in verse 1, now these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt. Now, I just want to give you a brief connection there, that you might recall that God had said to Abram that he would make his name great. And you might also recall at the Tower of Babel, they were trying to make for themselves a name. Well, and here in Egypt, we have a parallel. This is the names of the sons of Israel. Now, you might notice that Pharaoh here he's over them. This is after Joseph was gone, and after verse 7, the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land of Egypt, that is, was filled with them. And so the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, was concerned about this, and he said to his people, "Behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we." And so he says, "Come, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it be in the event of war that they join themselves to those who hate us and fight against us and go up from the land." So he appointed these taskmasters over them, and he had them build for Pharaoh storage cities. And the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and the more they spread out, so that they were in dread of the sons of Israel. Clearly, we find this parallel of being fruitful and multiplying and God blessing the people of Israel. So the Egyptians, according to verse 13, brutally compelled the sons of Israel to slave labor and made their lives bitter with hard slave labor in mortar and bricks and in all kinds of slave labor in the field. All their slave labor, which they brutally compelled them to do. Now, I want you to notice again the parallel. Pharaoh is trying to make himself great. He's trying to give himself a great name by building these structures and using bricks to do it. And that's a parallel back to the Tower of Babel. He's trying to make a name for himself. But here's what's amazing. In Exodus, the Pharaoh is never named. In verse 15, then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwife. He doesn't even give him a name. He just says he's the king of Egypt. He's the Pharaoh. But there's no name like Ramses II or Tutankhamun. There's no name given to this king. He's just a generic king of Egypt. What's even more interesting is he names these two midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. And so he gives them a name. We don't just know that they were two midwives. We actually know their names. And he said to them in verse 16, when you are helping Hebrew women to give birth and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, then you shall put him to death. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. Now, what's amazing there is that he was so concerned about Israel becoming strong amongst their nation that he was willing to kill off the sons of Israel, the Hebrew sons. And yet, these midwives feared God and did not do as the king had spoken to them. They chose civil disobedience and they let the boys live. Now, the Hebrew midwives were called by the king of Egypt. Again, there's no name here. The king of Egypt. And he says, why have you done this thing and let the boys live? Then the midwife said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife can come to them. Now, what's interesting about that is that some people wonder if they lied. Did they lie to Pharaoh in order to protect themselves? And I don't think they did. As a matter of fact, I know they didn't lie. I think that was a true story. I think the Israelite women were giving birth before they could ever get there. And I think that verse 20 helps us know that God was good to the midwives and the people multiplied and they became very mighty. And so what we find here is that God is blessing his people. That he's giving them blessing and they're multiplying and they're fulfilling Genesis 1:26-28, which says to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. They were being fruitful and multiplying and they were filling the land. Then God gave households to the midwives, and in verse 22, we find that Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive. And so this is the setup for a man named Moses. And we've already looked at this, but I want to look at it from a different angle. I want to show you that God raised up Moses to take his people on an exodus. He raised them up to deliver them. We should see that there is a parallel here. In the future, there would be a seed. That seed would deliver his people. And so we see this clear parallel between this man named Moses and the future Lord Jesus Christ, who will lead his people on another exodus. He will lead them on a spiritual exodus, but I believe he will also lead his people on a physical exodus in the tribulation period, delivering them from the tribulation that has come upon them from the world. We have to recognize that this motif, the Exodus motif, which will play out in the future when God delivers his people from tribulation, this motif is set here in Exodus and has been foretold by God in the past. In Deuteronomy 28, if we fast forward into the Pentateuch, what we find is in Deuteronomy 28 that God says, now it will be, if you diligently listen to the voice of Yahweh your God, being careful to do all his commandments, which I am commanding you today, Yahweh your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth. And all these blessings will come upon you and overtake you if you listen to the voice of Yahweh your God. He says, blessed you shall be in the city, and blessed you shall be in the field. Blessed shall be the offspring of your body, and the produce of your ground, and the offspring of your beast, and the increase of your herd, and the young of your flock. He goes on to say, Deuteronomy 28:7, Yahweh shall cause your enemies who rise up against you to be defeated before you. They will come out against you one way, and will flee before you 7 ways. And so what we find here in Deuteronomy 28, in these first few verses, is that if they obeyed the covenant that God had given them at Mount Sinai, we haven't really gotten into that yet. We will later in the study. But if the people obeyed that covenant, then God promised that he would care for them, that he would protect them. But in verse 15, it says that, but it will be, so this is future tense. So he's looking forward. So he says that if you obey, there's blessings. But now he says, but it will be if you do not listen to the voice of Yahweh your God to keep and to do all his commandments and his statutes, with which I am commanding you today, that all these curses will come upon you and overtake you. And then he says exactly the opposite. Cursed shall be you be in the city, and cursed shall you be in the field. Cursed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. Cursed shall be your offspring of your body and produce of your ground, the increase of your herd and the young of your flock. Then later, so we're talking about this, what happens when they disobey the covenant. God had promised that he would bless them if they obey, but he's now saying that they would be cursed if they don't obey. And here's what's interesting. In verse 64, this is Deuteronomy 28:64. It says, moreover, Yahweh will scatter you among all peoples, from the end of the earth to the other end of the earth. And there you shall serve other gods, wood and stone, which you and your fathers have not known. Moreover, among those nations you shall find no relief, and there will be no resting place for the sole of your foot. But there Yahweh will give you a trembling heart, failing of eyes, and despair of soul. So your life shall hang in doubt before you, and you will be in dread night and day, and you shall not have any faith in your life. In the morning you shall say, would that it were evening. And at evening you shall say, would that it were morning, because of the dread of your heart which you dread, and because of the sight of your eyes which you will see. And Yahweh will bring you back to Egypt in ships, by the way about which I spoke to you. You will never see it again. And there you will offer yourselves for sale as enemies, as male and female slaves, and there will be no buyer. What is being prophesied there is that God when they're disobedient, he would take them back into this exile, and they would be alone, and there will be no buyer for them. They would be slaves again. In Exodus 3, we've already looked at it, that they were slaves. Moses is telling them that in the future, this will happen again. Now, we have to see the connection here. We have to see this Exodus motif that is set up in the book of Exodus that will then be repeated in the future. And this is all prophesied. Deuteronomy was given to the people right as they were standing ready to go into the land. They were ready to conquer the land, and this was really the rah-rah speech that Moses is giving them and telling them this is what's going to happen. And so he's telling them the future. And so it's interesting that in chapter 30, we find, so this is right after 28 and 29. So 28 says, if you obey, I'm going to bless you. If you disobey, there'll be curses, and you're going to be scattered among the nations. And he says, when you disobey, this is what's going to happen. And you're going to be scattered, and you're going to be slaves again. And then it says in chapter 30, verse 1, so it will be when all these things have come upon you, the blessing and the curse which I have set before you, and you cause these things to return to your heart in all the nations where Yahweh your God has banished you, and you return to Yahweh your God and listen to his voice with all your heart and soul, according to all that I'm commanding you today, you and your sons, then Yahweh your God will return you from captivity and return his compassion on you. And he will gather you again from all the peoples where Yahweh your God has scattered you. If those of you who are banished are at the ends of the sky, from there Yahweh your God will gather you, and from there he will take you back. And Yahweh God will bring you into the land which your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it. And he will prosper you and multiply you more than your fathers. Moreover, Yahweh your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your seed to love Yahweh your God with all your heart and with all your soul, so that you may live. And Yahweh God will inflict all these curses on your enemies, on those who hate you, who persecuted you. And you shall return and listen to the voice of Yahweh, and you shall do all his commandments which I am commanding you today. Then Yahweh your God will prosper you abundantly in all the work of your hand, and in the offspring of your body, and in the offspring of your cattle, and the produce of your ground. For Yahweh will return you to rejoice over you for good, just as he has rejoiced over your fathers. When you listen to the voice of Yahweh your God to keep his commandments and statutes, which are written in this book of the law, when you return to Yahweh your God with all your heart and soul. For this commandment which I am commanding you today is not too difficult for you, nor it is far from you. It is not in heaven that you should say, who will go up to heaven for us and get it for us and make us hear it, that we may do it? Nor is it beyond the sea, nor should you say, who will cross the sea for us and get it for us and make us hear it, that we may do it? But the word is very near to you, and in your mouth and in your heart, so that you may do it. And what I want to point out here very clearly is that God says in the future that they will be taken on another Exodus. They will be taken from the lands. They've been scattered across the lands. Now they're going to be brought into the land. And I think this is ultimately going to be a physical deliverance where he actually returns them to the land, but it's also going to be a spiritual deliverance because he's going to sprinkle them clean. Now we find the same exact motif in Ezekiel 36. Now I believe we've already looked a little while ago in Ezekiel 36, but in chapter 36, verse 22, it says, therefore say to the house of Israel, thus says Lord Yahweh, it is not for your sake, O house of Israel, that I am about to act, but for my holy name, which you have profaned among the nations to which you have come. I will prove the holiness of my great name, which has been profaned among the nations, which you have profaned in their midst. Then the nations will know that I am Yahweh, declares Lord Yahweh, when I prove myself holy among you in their sight. And I will take you from the nations and gather you from all the lands and bring you into your own land. Now let me stop there. That's verse 24. That's a physical deliverance. That's a physical exodus. Now, that's going to happen in the future from the time of Ezekiel, which is future to Moses. So Moses says the same thing. Moses says that they would disobey, they would be scattered, and they'd be regathered. Ezekiel later in Revelation says exactly the same thing. Now, verse 24 very clearly says, I will gather you from all the lands, physical nations, and will bring you into your own land, a physical land. That's the physical aspect of this, but there's a spiritual aspect. In verse 25, he goes on to say, very much like Moses did, then I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean. And I will cleanse you from all your uncleanness and from all your idols. Moreover, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit within you, and remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes, and you will be careful to do my judgments. Now, what we must recognize here, again, this is this Exodus motif. What we must recognize here is that he is speaking directly to the house of Israel. He's saying that going to restore them to the land. He is going to sprinkle them clean. He's going to cleanse them from their uncleanness and from all their idols. And he is going to put a new heart in them and a new spirit within them. And he's going to remove the heart of stone from their flesh, and he's going to give them a heart of flesh. And so that is a clear connection back to Deuteronomy and a clear connection back to Exodus, where we see the Exodus motif is instituted amongst God's people, that God is going to lead them on an Exodus. And we see that coming up. We're going to see the first Exodus from Egypt. And then we're going to see now that motif is going to work its way out in the rest of Scripture. As we conclude, I want to give you a connection to the book of Revelation in the New Testament. In Revelation chapter 6, we find that then I looked when the Lamb opened one of the seven seals, and I heard four living creatures saying with a voice of thunder, Come. Then I looked, and behold, a white horse, and he who sits on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out overcoming and to overcome. And then we have the second seal being opened, and it's a red horse, and we have a third seal, and we have a fourth seal. In verse 8, then I look, and behold, a pale horse, and he who sits on it had the name Death, and Hades was following with him. Authority was given to them over the fourth of the earth, to kill with sword, with famine, with pestilence, and by the wild beast of the earth. And there was a fifth seal, and then there was a sixth seal. And these are progressive judgments on the world. And what's interesting is when you get to chapter 7, that's where we see the 144,000. It says in verse 1, After this, I saw four angels standing at the four corners of the earth, holding back the four winds of the earth, so that no wind would blow on the earth or on the sea or any tree. Then I saw the angel ascending from the rising of the sun, having the seal of the living God, and he cried out with a loud voice to the four angels to whom it was granted to harm the earth and the sea, saying, Do not harm the earth or the sea or the trees until we have sealed the slaves of our God on their foreheads. And I heard the number of those having been sealed, 144,000 sealed from every tribe of the sons of Israel. And he goes on and he describes the tribe. And so the tribes, after these judgments are poured out, we find then a deliverance of the tribes of Israel. That should remind you of the Exodus. That should remind you of God leading his people on an Exodus. And so what we find here is the same motif, the same Exodus motif that has been set in the book of Exodus in the Old Testament. So with that, we'll end there. And I hope that you have a great day. I hope that whatever you're doing today, that you would be doing all to God's glory and honor.